Welcome to this special edition of our Ask an Elder series. Today is the final episode of our three-part series featuring the best of our 2020 Ask an Elder interviews. Today's session will feature reflections on the distance traveled to secure our right to vote, the value of our voice, and the critical importance of mentors and mentoring and reaching back, packed with pearls of wisdom that are good for your soul. Without further ado, part 3 of our best of Ask an Elder.
So you talk about the electoral college needs to get removed, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. So what impact does my vote have really right now? We really have no control.
We have to show up at the polls. The press will be there. It'll be so glaring that the person who won by an overwhelming amount of votes, then nobody else can say that they were cheated out of it. That's the only way you can do it. We have to go to the polls in large numbers, Nobody can say, well, I'm going to stay home this time. No, you can't stay home this time. You got to get out and go vote. So you can get rid of that myth that, oh, I was cheated out the vote. I should have the presidency.
So even though Trump is evil, so is Biden. He's also a racist too. There's been pictures that's come out with him with the leader of the KKK and also Kamala Harris. She had a track record of incarcerating black men at a high rate. So either pick is not a good pick in the reality. So who would you vote for?
I'm voting for Biden. I'm voting for Biden because I know Biden. I know his work with President Obama. I trust Obama, so does millions of people. That's important to me. What Obama says is important.
Why is what Obama says important to you?
Because in 8 years, there was not one hint of scandal.
Okay.
In 8 years, there was not one hint of betrayal. This man has earned the trust of millions of people.
Okay.
So Kamala Harris as prosecuting attorney, all people are not good. There are crazy people everywhere in every race.
I mean, you say all these things, but how can you really convince me? Just because he worked with somebody doesn't mean he's not a bad person, regardless. So how can you convince me to say that I'm voting for the better person? And when I see him and Trump as an equal person, nothing. I don't think Trump's better than him. I don't think he's worse than him.
Well, you look at the track record. You can go by his track record. You go back to 1975 when Trump was in charge of renting apartments in his family apartment houses. Mm-hmm. He did not rent. He refused to rent to African Americans. I remember the case, there was a black nurse, well-trained, well-educated, who wanted to rent an apartment, had the money. He refused to rent to her because she was black, not because of any other reason. You look at the track record of a person. That's what you do when you get ready to go to vote. You study the track record of that person or persons to find out where they have stood over a period of time.
Yeah.
We know where Joe Biden has stood. We know where Trump has stood. We know what he said he's going to do. Mm. So you have to know where the person has stood over a period of time.
To kind of piggyback on your distrust, I wanted to know, because there's so many minorities and specifically Black people that don't trust the government because of, either medical experiments that have either went sideways or the government just simply not caring about Black people and it being blatantly shown. Well, what are they going to say when they think their vote doesn't count, or they think, there won't be any change in the government and in their own communities?
Well, you have to go back and look at a few things historically. And you have to ask yourself, and these people have not thought it through, to ask themselves, why do you think they wanted to obstruct the Black vote? Because now, if let's say all the Black folk in the South were allowed to vote before 1965, probably some of those senators and Congress people who are in Congress right now wouldn't have been there for 40 years. You understand what I'm saying? So you have to get out there and do it. I think if they just reason a little bit, they would see that they have an impact. But education is part of that, and they're not getting the education. I don't think they're getting good civic lessons in school. They don't know how our system works.
Not at all.
Yeah. And so if you don't take time to find out and think about some of the things that have happened in the past and try to reason that out, why do you think they didn't want us to vote?
Right.
Because it was so many of us, maybe it wouldn't be the same people elected that they wanted elected. So you just let them, they don't think that way.
I agree with you. I think part of the main reason why people my age don't want to vote or have a fear of voting is ignorance and their lack of education. I learned my first civics, I had my first civics class in the 8th grade, and I felt just like I didn't know anything, and everyone knew about the system, and I was just like, okay, let me not speak up. Let my voice really doesn't matter. And, you really have to go out of your own way and be uncomfortable to really learn. And that's how, that's life. Even with racism and taking Africana studies classes or things that you aren't familiar about, those things help you to grow as a person.
You have to speak up because your thoughts or what you have to say might strike that person who hears you and make an impact on that person. And even if it doesn't make an impact, you can disagree with that person and they'll know that, oh, well, now I better get off of this subject, okay? So never back down. I mean, always, it's a give and take.
Yeah.
And if you don't get out there and voice it and show it, then the white folk take advantage of it.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And it's not to say that every Black person who is elected, is some God or something. They have frailties just like everybody else. They're human. But if we stick to it, we can keep a portion of our people in office. And that's what we need to do.
My grandparents had known slavery. My grandmother that helped raise me, Geneva, she was more privileged than her mother and her grandmother before, but I was privileged to have been around them a little bit before their deaths. I attended my first school in 1956, Curtis Elementary School. It was totally segregated. It was a comfortable experience because we all looked alike. And the experiences that our parents had started instilling in us as even before we began school, we were always chaperoned away from downtown. We were never to question about going to the beach, and Clearwater, Florida has the most beautiful beach in the world. But during that time, we weren't even allowed to even think about going to a beach. We went to what we call the causeway, which a lot of our people died from the extreme currents in that, but that was our only swimming place. In school, our parents really, growing up in the South, and I actually learned later as I grew up that the most important focus for us at that time was that we wanted equality in our schools. It wasn't so much that we wanted to be integrated with others, but that we could accept segregation as long as it was equal, that our children were getting the same kind of books and opportunities to grow in their own communities, because our communities at that time were fastened on thriving at our level being more like other nationalities have been, where they prosper by understanding that they interact with themselves, and they buy, they sell, and those things were more important. As time progressed, integration was coming at a fast rate. Just especially, I was touched by Woolworth's integration because of the fact that many times I had been to Woolworth, and many times my grandmother would always say, "Now eat before you go," because you weren't allowed to ask for ice cream or anything, because you weren't allowed to sit down. The signs were clear. We saw many signs during that time of, we knew we weren't supposed to drink at the water fountain because the water fountain was white only. There were many buildings that restrooms were white only. So those things you learn early as a child. When I transferred, when I was in school and going from elementary school into Pinellas County. Pinellas County was my high school, junior high and high school, which was together. We had sectionalism in itself because of the book deficit, because of the teachers. You were singled out from the beginning after you left elementary school as to how you would thrive in the junior high, and then how you would thrive in senior high. Sectionalism made that the children who had the higher IQ got to the better books and got the better teachers, but we were segregated from ourselves, not only from the outside, but we were segregated inside, so that you could progress the ones that would make it in the world, to make changes. Then I was fortunate. I was one of honest students, and I was chosen to go to the first integrated high school, and that was Dunedin High School. We were supposed to ride a bus, a regular school bus, and we lived out of Clearwater, so we would have to be bused to Dunedin. And thinking that this was going to be changes that we were expecting, but when the integration started in the 60s, we were only 20 riding a bus every day to school because the white kids refused. Their parents wouldn't allow them to ride with us. We came up against the same things that many kids face. We were not allowed, and we were going to a school that housed over 1,000 children. We were not allowed to be in a classroom with more than one of us. And that was really hard because you weren't accepted by the white and you were alone. And so there were many meetings and many counseling sessions to try to help us to understand how to cope, because this was so important as a first step. It did do damage to us because we have no camaraderie with, I don't have no camaraderie with my former classmates and our former teachers. When it comes up that it's a time for alumni to gather, I don't feel like an alumni. I graduated with honors, but I felt lost of that time that I spent. Even though I knew it had a good purpose, it still didn't, it's later affected my life, because even as you look back at your times at high school and proms and things, these were things that did not happen for us being the first to try to integrate a system. And like I said before, it wasn't that we wanted to survive so much as an integrated community. Since it was coming, we could accept it. But our most important problem that we have faced was the fact of lack of funds to fund our schools, our communities, and still we see that today. We sometimes have migrated into areas where there's a lot of population of Black people, but the main thing is the funding is held up so that we don't thrive. And that's why it's so important for us to choose leaders that see the problems, because the problem is economics, and you're holding a race of people down. You are not letting them thrive. It's not that they want to thrive to be with you. You know, we choose who is in our company. We choose the people we want to be with. And that's what people fail to understand. You can live in any community as long as you put money into these communities, you're going to get something back from these communities. But as long as you try to hold communities into an area where you want them below the level, you want to continue this, I'm better than you, we're never going to get anywhere. Our people, in fact, have got to know, and like I was still, even as a Northerner, I came to the North, and it was an eye opener. It's more segregated than the South. Because one thing you do know, in the South, you know what to expect. In the North, it's a hidden dynamics that holds you down. And it was hard to grasp at first that this is supposed to be a place of more freedom of expression and a freedom of understanding how to thrive. And this area was a harder place to thrive because everything was in place and geared against you.
And one of the things I always tell folks when I was serving as president of the Anne Arundel County branch, NAACP in Maryland, I would always tell people there is no such thing as an off-year election. Anytime there's a vote, you need to vote, not just presidential years, because frankly, the presidential years, you're voting for the person that is absolutely the farthest from you.
Exactly.
As opposed to what is it, 2022 is going to be state legislature and governor. Mm-hmm. So we're in Annapolis, county seat, the state capital for Maryland. And it's not impossible to walk down the street and run into the governor or lieutenant governor. You will run into your delegates or school board members or whatever at the store. These are the people that have a great impact on your life. I mean, school boards right now are deciding if and when to open schools up for in-person learning. That's a decision that's going to affect your children and by extension, your family if they come home with something. So anytime there's a vote, you need to show up.
Right, and I think that's a perfect message to put out there because a lot of young people don't fully understand the impact of voting at a local level. And I think that when we think about young people voting, think about young Black men voting, what is a message that you would have for young Black men to get out and vote? Because a lot of us feel like our vote doesn't matter. That whatever's going to happen is going to happen regardless of if we go out to the ballots or not.
So I would just ask young Black men, Black women, anybody a question, but especially brown people, us, Latinos. If your vote were not important, why would people be going to such great lengths to steal your vote from you? That we were granted the ability to vote through the Constitution, post-Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Civil War era or post-Civil War era amendments to the Constitution that granted us vote, citizenship, etc. And so then they've been trying to take it ever since. my great-grandfather was a state legislator in North Carolina in the 70s, 1870s, State Senator George Allen Mebane. And he eventually was a candidate for Congress from North Carolina. He and one other African-American were running, and I think there was a white person running. And so ultimately he withdrew so that they would not split the votes. And the African-American, I think his name was Chatham or Cheatham, something like that, won and served for several terms. And then, of course, as you rolled into the 1900s, then all of the African-Americans who were in Congress were gone. And it was pretty much that way until I think like Adam Clayton Powell and a couple of folks like that got in the 1940s or 50s. And then it's been growing ever since. But we've been given the right to vote. And then every time you turn around, there are things done to steal, to diminish that capacity, that ability. Literacy tests, poll taxes, all kinds of things. And then just straight up intimidation. So for instance, when you hear the occupant saying, we're going to have poll watchers, what he basically means is that they're going to, quasi-deputize, these dudes walking around in fatigues with AR-15s over their shoulders to stand around polling places that are largely African-American or Latino, intending to intimidate. They don't want you to vote because if you vote, you can change things. Right. And so no one should ever believe. There are very few of elections that are determined by one vote, but there are a whole lot of elections that might be, say, one vote per county or one vote per precinct or something like that, that I think Michigan, Donald Trump won Michigan by 11,000 votes or something like that. So I'm sure there are 11,000 precincts or thereabouts in Michigan. And by the time if one additional person, two additional people had voted. And then Phil, this is another thing. You all were fortunate to have a presidential candidate and then a president in your lifetime that you were excited about, that you were proud of. Barack Obama, Barack and Michelle, and Malia and Sasha, our family in the White House. But understand that every election is not going to be one you're excited about, but you still need to vote. And so now this time we're voting between a 74-year-old man and a 77-year-old man who will be 78 on Inauguration Day. It's like, I'm not excited. Well, what you need to be excited about is the policies that they will bring to bear when they're sitting in the big chair.
What gives you hope? What drives you, especially in times of like this when some of us are in severe isolation, some of us are just lost, people are losing family members, we're in an ego-driven society and we're really just lost as a whole. And so what gives you hope in times like this?
Well, honestly, the first layer of things that give me hope is you guys. I love you youngins because y'all ain't having it. You'll call it like you see it. And for instance, the young people from Stoneman Douglas, I think the school is in Florida, where one of the number of mass shootings was in school shootings, and that they got very active and started coming for the legislators in Florida who wanted to have a gun in every hand, and they were opposing it. That you all, and then with matters of ethnicity, a lot of y'all don't care nearly as much about that. You listen to each other's music. You've gone to largely integrated schools, so you don't look at the other as something entirely unknown and foreign. Right. And then in issues of sexual identity and sexuality, y'all aren't getting all caught up on that either. What my son used to say, do you, you do you, I'm going to do me, but do you, so that you all don't get caught up on that because you don't have time. There's so many other more important things to focus on. So young people give me hope. I just need, again, as I said earlier, for you all to recognize that every election is not going to be one where you are thrilled with your options. But just have it in your mind, I got to make some choice here. Right. Because not voting potentially means that you are supporting the worst choice.
Yep.
So if it's like, well, I don't like this one, I really can't stand this one. Well, then vote for the one you don't like rather than the one you can't stand. And then after you vote, as I said, you be an advocate in your own behalf and hold them accountable. And if they won't do what you need them to do, another election's coming, fire them and get somebody that you are excited about. Or how about this? You can run. So young people give me hope. There's some white people who, as a result of what happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and James Blake and John Crawford III and Tamir Rice, et cetera, are waking up. Some of our white brothers and sisters, our white cousins, because at the end of the day, we're all 30th to 50th cousins with everybody else on the planet, which means you got a cousin Barack and Michelle, and you also have cousin Donnie and Melania, but they're all in the family. We all cousins. Right. So that white people are starting to wake up, and you know, again, the cell phone has been a gift in that way because it captures things. And then it's like when people try to tell you and interpret what you saw, no, I know exactly what I saw. I saw that man with his knee in another man's neck, a man that he knew, by the way, and used to work with when they both worked as bouncers as security in a nightclub in Minneapolis. So former Officer Chauvin knew his name is not Blake, but Floyd, George Floyd. He knew him. Kneels on his neck and kills him.
Crazy.
And so people are starting to get more awake. And so if we, again, pull folks together across neighborhood lines, across income lines, across skin color lines, and just try to do what is right for the greatest number of people, that can result in the changes that we need. So don't give in to despair. Don't give up. There's a scripture, Galatians 3:26, I think it is. It said, no, I'm sorry, Galatians 6:9 or 6:10. You will reap the harvest at the proper time if you do not give up. We will reap the harvest at the proper time, but we can't quit. We can't give up. We can't say, I'm not voting this time. We can't. You have to participate. You got to be in the game, make the best choice. And then if you don't see the best choice, you become the best choice and run yourself.
I like that.
Now, this is going to lead into that. Can you tell me why you think voting is so important, especially in this day and age?
I think voting is important because it gives you a feeling that you participate in your government. City elections, you can vote for the mayor, you can vote for your congressman, you can vote for the president, you can vote in all the elections that's going because it impacts what happens in your city, in your ward. If you got dirty ditches, sewage bad, you have a person that you voted for that you can go to and tell them, we need this problem solved, we need this problem fixed. If you want my vote, you have to improve the area in order for me to keep voting for you.
Can you tell me what it was like growing up in the deep segregated South?
Yes, ma'am, I sure can. I remember that when I was a kid, we had to ride the bus. We had to ride the back of the bus before Rosa Parks made her stand, and we had the bus boycotts. In Beaumont, Texas, we didn't have any black bus drivers. We only had Caucasian bus drivers. There was a sign on the bus, and it started off in the middle of the bus. But if white people got on the bus and they didn't have enough seats in the section that was specified for them, all they would have to do was pick the sign up and move it farther back. So that meant that the black people who were sitting in seats where the sign started had to get up and move to the back of the bus. And myself, I was allergic to the fumes from the bus. So most of the time, if I got on the bus, you could be sure that when I got off, I passed out. Many times I passed out from riding on the back of the bus. And also things that these kids today take for granted, we could not take for granted. I was 20 years old before I could go and sit in Morgan and Lindsay, which was a store like Woolworths, where they had a lunch counter. Mm-hmm. We could not go. I was 20 years old before I was allowed to go and sit at the lunch counter to eat. And that was in 1966.
Mhm.
That was the first time that I was allowed to go. And when we went to the courthouse, to a public facility, there was the bathroom that said blacks only or white only. And if you crossed the line, you would be in trouble. You could get to jail for just drinking water out of the same fountain that a white person did. And when my kids grew up, they could go to the fair, is what we called the South Texas State Fair. When I was a kid, we only had one day to go to the fair. We went, what the white people called it, and I don't like to use this word, but I'm going to use it because that's what they said.
Okay.
It was a nigger day at the fair. That's how they referred to it in Beaumont, Texas, in the 40s and the 50s. And we didn't know any better. We had parade, the bands from the different high schools played, it was because we were so happy that we could even get to go to that one day. And that nowadays my kids, when they were growing up, they thought they needed to go to the fair every day, but we didn't have that privilege. There was so many things that I saw when I was growing up, and I watched the struggle. I watched on television the Bloody Monday, when John Lewis and Martin Luther King, all those people walk across that bridge, and we saw them being beaten with clubs, billy clubs that the police had, being tear gassed. I saw all of that. I know people who marched. We had marches here in Beaumont, Texas. Reverends from different churches got out and marched with us so that we could be allowed to go sit at a lunch counter, be allowed to go to Lamar University. When I went to Lamar the first time in 1971 to take my class for vocational nursing, they only had a certain quota of Black people that they would allow. We had 11 people of color in my class at that time, and that was the only allowed. You couldn't, any white person could go, but only they had a quota for Blacks. That's how many they would accept. And when my brother first started going to Lamar University, they didn't have that many people of color going to Lamar University before the 60s.
Well, I think context is very important. When I was a student, which has been over 50 years ago, at Annapolis High School, integration had just come to the county in which I live. The famous Brown decision was done in 1954, and it was a decision made by the powers to be that integration would come in the county in which I live 12 years later, 1966. So for African Americans who lived in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, the only school that they were allowed to attend, the only high school they were allowed to attend, was Wally H. Bates High School. That school closed in 1966, and African Americans were permitted to integrate, if you will, into Annapolis High School, which is the flagship school. When I attended the school in 1969, 1970, it was after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. He was murdered in 1968. It was after the assassination of Malcolm X, who was also assassinated in 1965. It was after the assassination of Fred Hampton, who was a member of the Black Panther Party, who was assassinated in 1969. So I'm going to Annapolis High School, and there's approximately 2,000 students at this school. 500 of them are African American. And one of the things that would occur at the school was that they would have an assembly, and we didn't have a auditorium capable of having all 2,000 students at the same time. So assemblies in sections. And so at one of the assemblies in which I attended, there was about 500 people at the assembly. And the Student Government Association president, who was white, the principal, who was white, the assistant administrator, who was white, The entire program was being run by white people. And so they brought on a country and western performance where some people were performing country. Well, somebody in the audience shouted out, we want to hear some soul music, rhythm and blues. And the Student Government Association president responded by saying, this is our assembly. This is our program. And he finally said, and if you don't like it, you can leave. Well, he said it with such anger in his voice that a hush fell over the audience. And maybe it took me about 10 seconds for it to resonate. But I concluded he was right. If I didn't like what I was hearing and seeing, I should leave. And so I got up to leave the auditorium. It's a darkened auditorium. It's more than 500 people present. But what happened is when you get up, these seats would flap up when you got up. And so as I got up to leave, walking out of the auditorium, all of a sudden I kept hearing flap, flap, flap. And before I knew it, more than 150 Black students had joined me walking out in protest over what was going on. Once we were gathered, we decided there was time to bring about change at Annapolis High School. So we had a list of demands. And one of the demands we wanted at the time was to have the school's curriculum reflect Black studies, Black history. And we wanted to have more African-American administrators and teachers and staff, et cetera. So that March, and remember I'm 15, 16 years old, that protest led to a 2-week boycott of classes where Black students would show up at school. We weren't boycotting, we were boycotting classes, not school. So we would show up at school, and we had decided that what we would do is to have a teach-in where we'd learn about Black history and then teach it to our fellow students in the cafeteria. So for 2 weeks we did that. Students would come to school, refuse to go to class, and be part of this protest. So that is what initiated this demonstration. It went on for 2 weeks. Later, the mayor of the Annapolis, the NAACP president for Annapolis, as well as other adults, came to meet with us. And the primary purpose of the meeting with us was to convince us to return to classes. They acknowledged that we had some legitimate concerns, but they thought that our protest was not being constructive. So each of these adults were telling us why we should go back to class. And the mayor gave his pitch, a president of the NAACP gave his pitch, and we as students weren't budging, because nowhere in what they were saying, we thought, would bring about the kind of progress that we wanted. So finally, one of the speakers, a guy who was the NAACP chair of the Education Committee, spoke to the audience, mostly Black. And he told us that if we returned to class, all the things we wanted, we could have within 30 days. And students booed him, saying 30 days seemed like to us forever and it was too long. He then tried to say, well, give us 3 weeks and we'll do these changes, which included more faculty members, as well as a Black Studies curriculum. And again, he was booed. He finally said, give us 2 weeks. And if we don't do this within 2 weeks, you can, quote, do your own thing, which was a popular slogan at that time. And again, the students booed him, saying 2 weeks was not long enough. But I thought about that and I said, well, 2 weeks doesn't seem like a god awful time. And so I spoke to the students and suggested that we go back to class for 2 weeks. If they were going to make these commitments that we're going to have all these things we wanted, we would do it. And we went back to class. Well, suffice it to say, they did not keep their promise. They, in effect, lied to us. And so on February 12th, 1970, which is the birthday of Abraham Lincoln, which is why this day was chosen, we decided that we're going to have a new demonstration. And this time, our goal would be never to leave these, go back to class until we had more written assurances that these promises were going to be upheld. So one of our students, a female student, she worked in the office of administrator. And in those days, they had what they call mimeograph machines, where you would create leaflets through a mimeographing. And she was in and had developed this mimeograph, which talked about calling on students to not attend class on February 12th, given all the reasons why students shouldn't attend class. And her goal was to print out these leaflets so we could distribute them. But what happened was she was caught in the act of doing this by one of the staff members who took the leaflet from her. And unbeknownst to the staff member and later the principal, they did not realize that we had not been able to distribute a single leaflet. The only leaflet that we had was the one that they had confiscated. But they didn't know that. So the principal, on that same day, addressed the students over the public address system. As I told you, there were 2,000 students. And what he said was, we understand that there's a protest being planned for February 12th. It's going to start at such and such a time. Anybody involved in participating in this protest will be disciplined. Well, he had just alerted the entire school system about the demonstration they knew nothing about. And in those days, if you told students that they couldn't do something, they did the opposite of what he did. So we had hundreds of people show up.
Because if you're not going to read your history, somebody's got to be able to tell you what you don't have to put up with. The historical stuff I read told me what I didn't have to put up with. It mattered to me. Reading was my favorite passion, that and playing music, because reading took me away someplace else through somebody else's words and experiences that were good. When I was in junior high school, I found a series of books that talked about the Civil War, and they were mainly fiction. That fiction in the Civil War stuff made me go look at real historical novels, real historical books written by historians about the Civil War, and then the place of race within what made the Civil War happen. And then you begin to realize that we're a commodity, just like a bale of cotton. And the more I read about slavery and how people are mistreated, families are separated, I get mad. But my way of paying people back who don't do it right is to be the best person I can be. First, you sit on the front row, whatever class you're in. You get there before the class starts. And you always stay just a little bit. If you got any questions at all, you go ask the teacher. You don't try to figure it out. You don't walk off with your friends. Stay, but do sit on the front row, not the second row, not the third. Don't be sitting in the back. Front row, because that's what you're there for. 2, the company you keep is very important. If all people want to do is drink, get high, and party, you with the wrong people, because you're not going to get your work done. And you're going to slip off and don't even know you're slipping off the edge. So we always try to tell the young ladies, and people would tell me, Sharon, you don't want to go off with them. Oh, well, they're going to da-da-da. No, Sharon, come on, go with us. And I would go with the ones who were sensible. The company you keep and the spirit you hold is everything. There's no other way you're going to be a good person.
This message has been brought to you by the National Black Leadership and Empowerment Project.